What do you do when you're 50 meters ahead of your team, knee-deep in Mekong mud, and you realize 40 enemy fighters are 10 feet below you? Not in a training scenario, not with time to think, right now. Your brothers are exposed behind you, still moving through elephant grass. The enemy hasn't seen them yet. But one of the guerrillas just shifted his AK-47, and in 3 seconds, he's going to look up. Every option ends badly. Retreat means your team gets shredded crossing open ground. Hold position means they spot you, and 40 rifles open up simultaneously. Advance alone means you're walking into a kill box designed for squads. You have your Stoner 63. You have zero backup. You have no time. What do? Petty Officer 2nd Class Michael Hawkins, call sign Hawk, 24 years old from Boise, Idaho, had spent 9 months as point man for SEAL Team 1 in the Mekong Delta. Point men don't get chosen for marksmanship or strength. They get chosen because they see threats before threats see them. Hawkins could read terrain like most men read newspapers. The way water moved around submerged roots, the angle of broken grass, the smell of rice cooking where no village should be. His team stayed alive because Hawk's instincts worked 3 seconds faster than everyone else's. He'd brought them through 47 patrols without contact. Not because they were lucky, because he was that good. He didn't know that in 8 seconds, those instincts would force him to make a choice that violated every tactical principle the Navy had taught him. If you're watching this, you recognize that military history isn't just about tactics and technology. It's about the impossible decisions made by men under conditions most of us will never comprehend. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying the choices they faced. Point men like Hawk operated in a world where hesitation meant body bags. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes.
Michael Hawkins hadn't planned on becoming a SEAL. He'd planned on becoming a forest ranger. Boise, Idaho didn't produce many Navy men. It produced hunters, fishermen, men who understood that survival in the wilderness required reading signs most people never noticed. His father had taught him to track elk through mountain timber by watching how birds reacted to movement. By 16, Hawk could tell you what had passed through an area 3 hours ago just by reading disturbed pine needles and broken spider webs. When he enlisted in '67, it wasn't patriotism that drove him. It was a girl who'd left for college and a restlessness that made staying in Boise feel like suffocating. Buds broke most men. It didn't break Hawkins because he'd learned something in those Idaho mountains that instructors couldn't teach: how to make his body invisible by making his mind quiet. While other candidates fought Hell Week with aggression, Hawk simply became part of the environment. The instructors noticed. By graduation, they'd tagged him for point man training. He didn't carry a photo of the girl who'd left. He carried a small, smooth river stone from the Boise River, something his father had given him the day he shipped out. When you're lost, his old man had said, hold this and remember, the quieter you become, the more you hear. Vietnam taught him his father was right. The Delta wasn't Idaho timber, but the principles were identical. Motion attracted death, noise attracted death, impatience attracted death. So Hawk learned to move through water without creating ripples, through grass without disturbing insects, through villages without dogs barking. His teammates called him Ghost. The Viet Cong called him something else. There were rumors of a white demon who appeared and vanished. Hawk didn't care about the mythology. He cared about bringing his brothers home, and he'd kept that promise through 47 patrols. Not one KIA, not one medevac for anything worse than infected leech bites. The strategic situation in the Mekong Delta by August 1970 was a stalemate masquerading as victory. After Tet in '68, American forces had regained tactical control of most territory. But tactical control meant nothing when the enemy operated from hidden tunnel networks and supply caches that turned entire regions into logistical arteries. The Phoenix program was identifying Viet Cong infrastructure. CIA intelligence indicated a major cache somewhere in the My Tho River system. Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies flowing to units preparing for the next offensive. Find that cache, destroy it, and you could cripple enemy operations for months. That's why SEAL Team 1 had inserted into this particular stretch of the Delta. Not for body count, for interdiction, for cutting the enemy's lifeline before they could use it. Hawk's platoon, 8 men including him, had been running night patrols for 3 weeks. Nothing. Every village they checked came up clean. Every tree line looked innocent. Intelligence said the cache was here. Reality said it had vanished, until Hawk's instincts said otherwise. Stories like Hawk's don't survive in official records. They survive because people share them. If you served or knew someone who did, the comment section below isn't just a place to type. It's where these memories live on. If you've experienced that moment when training becomes instinct, when doctrine becomes irrelevant, when everything depends on one decision you have 3 seconds to make, add your story below. These accounts matter. 40 meters below where Hawk stood, Senior Lieutenant Nguyen Van Thao commanded a Viet Cong supply unit that had survived 3 years of American airstrikes, artillery barrages, and ARVN sweeps. He was 29 years old. He'd fought the French as a teenager. He'd survived Dien Bien Phu not by firing a rifle, but by carrying ammunition through tunnel networks, while French artillery turned the valley into a moonscape. The Americans had better technology, better air support, better everything. They did not have better knowledge of this land. Thao had been born 6 kilometers from this cache. He'd fished these rivers as a child. He knew which routes flooded during monsoon season, which trails became impassable, which villages could be trusted, which could not. His 40 men weren't conscripts. They were veterans, most with combat experience dating back to the late 50s. They'd learned that American technology meant nothing if you stayed underground during the day and moved only at night. They'd learned that American helicopters couldn't see through triple canopy jungle, that American night vision equipment performed poorly in humidity, that American patrols followed predictable patterns because their commanders rotated every 6 months and never learned the terrain. Thao's unit had moved 7 tons of supplies through this cache in the past month without being detected once. They weren't lucky, they were professional. The cache itself was a masterwork of engineering. 3 meters underground, reinforced with scavenged timber, ventilated through reed tubes disguised as natural growth, accessible only through a concealed hatch covered by water and vegetation. American patrols had walked within 10 meters of it 17 times without noticing. South Vietnamese forces had set up a temporary checkpoint 50 meters away and never suspected. The cache had survived because Thao understood something most American commanders didn't. Invisibility isn't about hiding. It's about becoming part of the landscape so completely that no one thinks to look. Today, Thao was rotating his men out before the next supply run. By nightfall, they'd be gone. By tomorrow morning, this location would be empty again, waiting for the next shipment. The Americans would never know it existed. He was wrong about that. For SEAL Team 1, success wasn't about firepower. It was about intelligence. Find the cache, document it, call in air support or demolitions, extract before enemy reinforcements arrived. Hawk's platoon leader, Lieutenant Commander James Fredericks, 31, Annapolis graduate on his second tour, had planned this operation for precision, not confrontation. 6 men in 2 fire teams. Hawk walking point 50 meters ahead, reading terrain. The rest following in tactical column, silent, weapons at low ready. The objective was confirmation, not contact. If they found the cache, they'd mark coordinates, withdraw, and let airstrikes do the rest. Clean, professional, by the book. Except Hawk had just detected something 50 meters ahead that changed everything. The water around a cluster of reeds was moving wrong. Not from current, from ventilation. Something underground was displacing air, and that air was escaping through those reeds. He'd stopped moving. Behind him, the platoon had stopped too, watching their point man process information they couldn't see. Fredericks clicked his radio twice. Silent question. What is it? Hawk didn't respond immediately. He was counting. 1 reed cluster, 2, 3, arranged in a pattern too regular to be natural, and underneath, barely audible, voices. Vietnamese, multiple speakers, close. He'd found it. If you're still watching, you already understand something most people don't. That military history isn't about glorifying war, it's about honoring the people who fought them. Hawk's decision in the next 30 seconds would define his entire career, but it would also define the lives of the 7 men behind him and the 40 men below him. Subscribe now and join the community that refuses to let these stories become footnotes. And hit that like button. It tells YouTube these stories deserve reach. Because understanding both sides isn't weakness. It's the only honest way to tell what happened next. The first thing Hawk felt was wrongness, not danger. Point men lived with danger every second. This was different. This was the sensation of standing over something alive, something hidden, something that could erupt. The mud beneath his boots felt hollow. The air smelled wrong. Not jungle rot, but human sweat, cooking rice, gun oil, the specific cocktail of scents that meant men had been living underground for weeks. He'd smelled it before in tunnel complexes after they'd been cleared. But this was fresh. This was now. The second thing he heard made his throat close. Voices, Vietnamese, multiple speakers, and they weren't whispering. They were conversing normally, the way men talk when they feel safe, which meant they didn't know anyone was above them, which meant his platoon had maybe 60 seconds before someone looked through a firing port or ventilation shaft and spotted 7 Americans standing in a kill zone with 0 cover. The third thing he saw almost made him move too fast. One of the reed clusters shifted, not from wind, from below. Someone underground had just brushed against the ventilation tube from inside, and the reeds above had moved 6 inches, which meant the cache entrance was right there, 10 feet in front of him. And if someone climbed out to check the perimeter, which standard Viet Cong doctrine said they should do every 30 minutes, the first thing they'd see was an American SEAL standing directly over their position. The fourth thing he smelled made the decision for him. Propellant. Not the burnt cordite from old firefights. Fresh propellant. Which meant someone below was handling ammunition, loading magazines, preparing weapons. Which meant this wasn't a dormant cache. This was an active staging area. The fifth thing he tasted was copper. Not blood, fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize your teammates are 50 meters behind you, walking into an ambush they can't see. and you're the only person who knows it. Behind him, 60 meters back now, Lieutenant Commander Fredericks had stopped the column. Hawk's hand signals had been clear. Contact, underground, multiple enemy, danger close. Standard operating procedure was immediate withdrawal, call for gunship support, establish defensive perimeter, let air assets handle it. The SEAL teams had learned in '68 that small unit tactics against dug-in positions meant casualties. Better to locate, mark, extract, destroy from distance. But Fredericks couldn't see what Hawk saw. He couldn't see that one of the Viet Cong fighters had just emerged from the cache entrance, 30 feet to Hawk's left, scanning the tree line in the wrong direction. The man was young, maybe 20, carrying an AK-47 with a magazine already seated. He was conducting a security sweep, rotating his sector, and in 8 seconds his scan pattern would bring him around to face Hawk's position. From the Viet Cong perspective, this was routine. Senior Lieutenant Thao rotated security every 30 minutes. Young fighters got assigned perimeter duty because it kept them alert, kept them trained, kept them ready. This particular fighter, Van Van Duke, 19, from a village north of Saigon, had been with Thao's unit for 7 months. He was competent. He followed procedure. He understood that American patrols rarely operated this deep during daylight, that ARVN forces never patrolled at all, that security sweeps were more about discipline than actual threat detection. He was turning. His eyes were scanning left to right. In 5 seconds, he'd be looking directly at Hawk. Hawk had 3 choices: freeze and hope the guerrilla's eyes passed over him without recognition. Possible if he'd been wearing camouflage. Impossible in olive drab fatigues against green jungle. Retreat and hope his movement didn't attract attention. Guaranteed to fail because motion attracts eyes faster than stillness. Or move forward, close the distance before the guerrilla's scan reached him, neutralize the threat silently. Standard doctrine said freeze. Training said retreat. Instinct said neither would work. The guerrilla's scan was 3 seconds from Hawk's position. Behind Hawk, his platoon was still frozen, waiting for his signal. They couldn't see the guerrilla. They couldn't see the cache entrance. They couldn't see that in 90 seconds, 40 more fighters would realize something was wrong and pour out of that entrance with enough firepower to shred 6 men in open terrain. Hawk made his decision. He moved, not toward the guerrilla, toward the cache entrance, 10 feet, full sprint, Stoner 63 coming up to low ready. The guerrilla heard him, turned, started to shout, and Hawk's training took over. 3-round burst, center mass, suppressed by jungle noise, the guerrilla dropping before the shout became a word. And then Hawk did something no SEAL manual covered. He didn't retreat. He didn't signal his team. He didn't wait for backup. He stepped directly over the cache entrance, looked down through the opening, and saw what intelligence had been searching for 3 weeks. 40 men, stacked weapons, ammunition crates, medical supplies, radio equipment, maps spread on makeshift tables, and every single face turning toward the entrance because they'd just heard something impossible. Gunfire above them, inside their security perimeter. Thao saw him first, an American, alone, backlit by jungle canopy, standing directly over their only exit. For 1 frozen second, the entire cache went silent, both sides processing the impossible. Then Thao shouted the order that would have saved his men if Hawk had been anyone else. Weapons. Weapons. 40 fighters reached for 40 rifles. Hawk made his second decision. He didn't throw a grenade. Grenades in confined spaces meant friendly casualties from shrapnel traveling through the entrance. He didn't call for his team. They were too far away. He didn't retreat. Retreating meant 40 guerrillas pouring out behind him with clear fields of fire at his brothers. He opened fire, not controlled bursts, not aimed shots, pure suppressive violence. The Stoner 63 was designed for exactly this: sustained fire, high rate, belt-fed, devastating in close quarters. Hawk pointed it through the entrance and held the trigger. The sound was apocalyptic. He'd detected what others missed because he'd learned to read what wasn't there. The stillness of birds, the angle of reeds, the smell of men who felt safe. Training hadn't taught him that. Idaho had. The Stoner 63 cycled at 550 rounds per minute. Hawk was firing through an opening 18 inches wide into a space roughly 20 feet by 30. Basic mathematics said he couldn't miss. Basic physics said the rounds were ricocheting off concrete walls, fragmenting off metal ammunition crates, turning the entire underground cache into a blender of lead and shrapnel. Basic psychology said 40 trained fighters should have returned fire immediately. They didn't, because something happened in that cache that no one had trained for. In the first 2 seconds of fire, 3 guerrillas went down, not from direct hits, but from ricochets that defied trajectory prediction. The 4th and 5th tried to return fire toward the entrance and realized their rifles weren't pointing where their eyes were looking because they were disoriented by muzzle flash reflecting off walls. The 6th through 10th dropped their weapons and dove for cover behind ammunition crates. The worst possible decision because those crates were exactly what Hawk's rounds were perforating. Senior Lieutenant Thao understood immediately what Hawk's team 50 meters away was only beginning to process. They weren't under attack from a SEAL platoon. They were under attack from one man who decided that survival meant offense, not defense. And that realization created a cascade of tactical errors that saved Hawk's life. Thao shouted for concentrated fire at the entrance. 15 fighters responded, but they weren't firing at a stationary target. Hawk had stopped firing, shifted position 3 feet, and resumed from a different angle. The return fire hit where he'd been, not where he was. And every round the Viet Cong fired into their own ceiling brought down dirt, debris, and structural timber that had been holding the cache together for 3 years. The cache was collapsing. Back at the platoon position, Lieutenant Commander Fredericks heard what his point man was doing and couldn't believe it. The tactical radio was silent. Hawk wasn't reporting because Hawk was too busy staying alive. But the sound signature was unmistakable. That wasn't suppressive fire from a squad. That was sustained fire from one weapon, which meant Hawk had either lost his mind or found something so dangerous that standard doctrine had become irrelevant. Fredericks made the decision every SEAL officer dreads: trust your point man or pull him out. He chose trust. Move up. Contact front. Hawk's in trouble. The platoon broke into a run, covering 60 meters through elephant grass with zero noise discipline, because noise discipline no longer mattered. Their brother was in a gunfight they couldn't see against enemies they couldn't count, and SEAL doctrine had exactly one rule for that situation: get there first, ask questions later. What happened next would be debated in Fort Bragg classrooms for the next 30 years. Hawk heard his team coming. He knew they were 40 seconds away. He knew the Viet Cong below him were regrouping, that Thao was shouting orders, that in 10 seconds 15 rifles would concentrate fire at the entrance simultaneously, and he'd be dead before his team arrived. So he did the last thing anyone expected. He jumped into the cache. Not through the entrance, through the collapsing ceiling, 20 feet behind where the guerrillas were focused, landing in total darkness with nothing but muzzle flash to navigate by. And he kept firing. For 3 seconds, No one in that cache understood what had happened. The American had been above them. Now he was behind them, and the Stoner 63 was cycling through its belt at a rate that made return fire suicidal because you couldn't identify targets in the dark, couldn't tell friend from enemy, couldn't process that one man with one weapon had just turned 40 against one into a close-quarters melee where numbers meant nothing. Van Duke, the young guerrilla who'd almost spotted Hawk on the surface, found himself face-to-face with the American in near-total darkness. He raised his AK-47. Hawk swept it aside with the Stoner's barrel and kept firing past him at targets deeper in the cache. Duke dropped his rifle and ran for the entrance. 12 others followed, not because they were cowards, because human psychology has a breaking point, and that point is reached when suppressive fire comes from inside your defensive position instead of outside it. Thao tried to rally them. Hold position, hold position. 8 fighters responded, taking cover behind concrete support pillars, firing controlled bursts toward where they thought the American was. They were aiming at muzzle flash. Hawk was no longer where the muzzle flash indicated. He'd shifted again, moving through the cache like he'd trained there, like he could see in the dark, like he was everywhere and nowhere. He couldn't. He was guessing, and every guess was correct because his instincts, those Idaho-trained, point-man-honed instincts, were reading the space by sound, by air movement, by the way voices echoed off walls. He wasn't thinking, he was reacting. And reaction speed beats conscious thought every time. The promise he'd made to himself, bring everyone home, no casualties, no KIAs, that promise was now impossible to keep. Because the only way to save his brothers was to become what he'd spent 9 months avoiding: visible, loud, the center of attention. Point men don't draw fire, but Hawk just had. His team hit the cache entrance 6 seconds later. Frederick saw 13 guerrillas pouring out, scattering into jungle, abandoning weapons. He made the split-second call: let them run or chase them. He chose Hawk. Inside! Hawk's inside! 4 SEALs poured through the entrance, night vision goggles down, scanning for their point man. They found him in the center of the cache, Stoner 63 empty, sidearm drawn, standing over Senior Lieutenant Thao, who'd taken 3 rounds to the chest and was still trying to reach his weapon. Hawk kicked the weapon away. Not because Thao was a threat, because SEALs don't shoot unarmed men. The cache was silent. The firefight had lasted 14 seconds. 40 guerrillas had been inside. 27 had fled. 8 were down. 5 were wounded. 0 had surrendered because surrender wasn't part of their doctrine. And 1 SEAL was standing in the middle of it, breathing hard, eyes wide, processing what he'd just done. Fredericks looked at him. "What the hell, Hawk?" Hawk didn't answer immediately. He was looking at Thao, who was dying but still conscious, still trying to reach his sidearm even though his hands wouldn't respond. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. But in that moment, Hawk understood something he'd spent 40 years trying to explain. Courage exists on both sides. Professionalism exists on both sides. And violence doesn't care about doctrine. "They saw us," Hawk finally said. "If I'd pulled back, they'd have hit you crossing open ground." Fredericks nodded. "Because that's all you say when your point man just saved your entire platoon by doing something no manual covers." The cache that intelligence had searched for 3 weeks contained 7 tons of supplies, AK-47 rifles, 43 stacked in wooden crates, PKM machine guns, 6 with linked ammunition belts, RPG-7 launchers, 4 with 19 rockets. medical supplies, enough antibiotics, morphine, and surgical equipment to support 2 companies for 3 months. Radio equipment, American PRC-25s captured from ARVN units, frequency lists still attached, maps, hand-drawn, detailed, showing supply routes that CIA analysts had been guessing at for 6 months, and documents, orders, unit designations, names. Fredericks understood immediately that they'd just intercepted a logistics hub, not a supply dump. This wasn't storage, this was distribution. Every weapon here was tagged for a specific unit. Every medical crate had a destination written in careful Vietnamese script. This cache was feeding the entire Mytho operational area, and destroying it meant crippling enemy operations for months. But extraction had just become complicated. Hawk's 14-second firefight had announced their presence to every Viet Cong unit within 5 kilometers. Standard procedure was mark coordinates, extract, call airstrike. But airstrikes couldn't capture documents. Airstrikes couldn't identify supply routes from hand-drawn maps. And the intelligence value of what they'd found exceeded the tactical value of destroying it remotely, which meant they had to hold this position long enough to photograph everything, catalog it, extract it, and get out before reinforcements arrived. And reinforcements were already moving. Radio intercepts were lighting up, panicked transmissions from the 13 guerrillas who'd fled, calling for support, reporting American forces at the cache. Fredericks had maybe 20 minutes before this location became a magnet for every enemy unit in the district. 20 minutes, 6 SEALs, an underground cache with 1 entrance, and a point man who'd just burned through 2/3 of his ammunition. The game changer arrived 9 minutes later. Not from the sky, from the water. 2 PBRs, Patrol Boat River, call signs Copperhead 2-1 and Copperhead 2-2, had been running interdiction patterns 6 kilometers south. They'd heard the firefight. Standard doctrine said PBRs didn't insert into hot zones. But the boat commander on 2-1 was a chief petty officer named Marcus Holt, 41, 3 tours, who'd worked with SEAL teams long enough to know what sustained fire from a stoner meant. One of his SEALs was in trouble. He made the decision without requesting permission. 2-2, follow my lead. We're going in. The PBRs hit the insertion point 4 minutes later. Twin 50 caliber machine guns scanning for threats, engines screaming defiance at doctrine. Holt's radio crackled. Any SEAL unit, this is Copperhead 2-1. We are at your 6, ready for extract or fire support, over. Fredericks had never been so relieved to hear a boat commander's voice. Copperhead 2-1, SEAL Team 1-3. We need extract plus fire support. Cache secured, but enemy reinforcements inbound. How copy? Solid copy, SEAL. We'll hold the perimeter. Get your asses to the boats. Except they couldn't. Not yet. The documents hadn't been photographed. The maps hadn't been copied. The intelligence value of this cache would evaporate the moment they left, because enemy reinforcements would sanitize everything before airstrikes could level it. Hawk made the call. LT, I'll stay. Photograph everything. You get the team to the boats, I'll follow. Fredericks looked at him like he'd suggested staying for tea. Negative. We all go or no one goes. Sir, this intel is worth more than the cash. You know it. I stay 20 minutes, get everything on film, destroy what I can't carry, meet you at the secondary extract. Standard E&E. I've done it before. He had. Twice. Both times successfully. But both times without enemy reinforcements actively hunting for him. Point men don't hesitate. That's the rule. That's what makes them point men. But this wasn't hesitation. This was recognition that intelligence wins wars, and sometimes one man staying behind is worth more than 6 men extracting together. Fredericks knew it. His team knew it, and they hated that they knew it. Hawk, if you're not at secondary extract in 40 minutes, I'll be there in 30. He was lying. They both knew it. 30 minutes wasn't enough time to document 7 tons of supplies, rig demolitions, and escape through hostile territory. But SEAL leaders learn to accept necessary lies when the truth means losing intelligence that could save dozens of future missions. Fredericks made the decision. Everyone out except Hawk. We hold the boats 30 minutes, then extract with or without him. Hawk, you missed that window. You're walking to Cambodia. Understood, sir. The team pulled out. Hawk stayed, alone, in an underground cache, with a half-empty stoner, a sidearm, 4 magazines, and 28 minutes before enemy reinforcements turned his position into a kill zone. From the Viet Cong perspective, the situation had shifted from disaster to opportunity. Thao was dead. 8 fighters were dead, but 27 had escaped, and they'd made contact with a full company staged 3 kilometers north. Captain Tran Van Min, the company commander, understood immediately what the American strategy was. Grab intelligence, extract fast, call airstrike later, standard SEAL doctrine, which meant if his company moved fast enough, they could catch the American unit at their extract point and turn an intelligence raid into an ambush. He had 2 platoons, 60 fighters, against 6 Americans retreating to boats. The mathematics were favorable. He ordered immediate advance, double time, no noise discipline because speed mattered more than stealth. What Min didn't know, what no one knew, was that only 5 Americans had retreated to the boats. 1 had stayed behind. The stakes Fredericks had weighed, intelligence value versus team safety, had been decided not by doctrine, but by the reality that point men learn first. Sometimes the mission requires 1 man to do what 6 can't. And Hawk had just volunteered to be that man. Hawk worked fast. Nikon F camera, Tri-X film, 36 exposures per roll. He had 4 rolls, which meant 144 photographs to document 7 tons of material. He shot the maps first, full detail, every route, every waypoint, every village marked as friendly or hostile. Then the documents, orders, unit rosters, supply manifests. Then the weapons, serial numbers visible, manufacturer marks clear. Then the radio equipment, the medical supplies, everything intelligence analysts would need to understand how this network functioned. 18 minutes into his timeline, he heard the first sounds of movement outside. Not his team. Wrong direction. Enemy. Multiple contacts. Moving fast. He had maybe 3 minutes before they reached the entrance. He'd photographed 90% of the cache. Close enough. He rigged demolition charges, C4 blocks on the ammunition crates, time delay fuses set for 4 minutes. Enough time to get clear, not enough time for enemy forces to disarm them. Then he grabbed the most critical documents, stuffed them in his waterproof bag, and moved toward the entrance. 50 guerrillas were converging on his position. He was 1 man with 90 rounds left. Standard SEAL doctrine said this was suicide. Hawk's instincts said something different. They think I already left. Which meant if he moved fast, stayed quiet, used the chaos of their advance to mask his escape, he might reach the secondary extract before they realized he was gone. He climbed out of the cache, low-crawled through elephant grass, and disappeared into the jungle 30 seconds before the first enemy patrol reached the entrance. Behind him, C4 blocks started their countdown. 4 minutes, 360 seconds. Hawk counted every one. The demolition charges detonated at 1347 hours. 7 tons of ammunition, 4 RPG rockets, and enough C4 to level a building went up simultaneously. The explosion was visible from 3 kilometers away. The sound rolled across the Mekong Delta like thunder, and 60 Viet Cong fighters who'd been converging on the cache entrance found themselves thrown backward by an overpressure wave that turned jungle into shrapnel. 8 didn't get up. 19 were wounded badly enough to need immediate medevac, except medevac wasn't coming because their radio operator had been inside the cache when it detonated. Captain Min survived because he'd been in the rear of the advance. He also understood immediately what had happened. The American hadn't fled. He'd stayed long enough to rig the entire cache, extract the intelligence, and escape while Min's company walked into a trap. From a tactical perspective, the operation was a success. SEAL Team 1 had located a strategic cache, eliminated its garrison, extracted critical intelligence, and destroyed 7 tons of enemy supplies. 0 American casualties, enemy casualties, 33 KIA, 24 WIA, and a logistics network crippled for months. Air Force intelligence would analyze those documents for 3 weeks and identify supply routes that had been invisible for 2 years. From a personal perspective, the cost was just beginning. Hawk made it to the secondary extract with 4 minutes to spare. He collapsed onto the PBR deck with his waterproof bag clutched against his chest, Stoner 63 still in his other hand, eyes wide, breathing like he'd surfaced from a 30-meter free dive. Chief Holt looked at him and didn't ask questions. You don't ask point men what they've seen. You just get them home. The boat ride back to base took 90 minutes. Hawk didn't speak. His team didn't push. They'd learned in Bud S that silence after contact meant processing, and processing took time. Frederick sat next to him, hand on his shoulder, saying nothing. Because sometimes nothing is the only thing that makes sense. Debriefing at Nha Bay took 3 hours. Intelligence officers wanted details. Fredericks provided them. Hawk sat in the corner, stone-faced, methodically cleaning the stoner, even though it had already been cleaned twice. The river stone from his father, the one he kept in his pocket, was clenched in his left hand hard enough that his knuckles were white. The official after-action report documented the operation as a successful interdiction raid resulting in significant enemy casualties and high-value intelligence capture. It mentioned Hawk's actions in 2 sentences. Point Man detected enemy cache through observation of environmental anomalies. Point Man provided suppressive fire enabling team extract. 2 sentences. 14 seconds of combat that saved 6 lives. 40 fighters engaged by 1 operator. Intelligence that would prevent dozens of future ambushes. 2 sentences. What the report didn't mention was what Hawk told no one. He'd seen Senior Lieutenant Thau's face in those final seconds. Seen him reaching for his weapon not because he thought he could win, but because surrender wasn't in his doctrine. Seen him die not as an enemy, but as a professional, doing exactly what Hawk would have done in his position. And Hawk carried that face. He carried all of them, the young guerrilla who'd been conducting a security sweep and died for it, the fighters who'd fled into the jungle and were probably still running, the 8 who hadn't made it out before the demolitions detonated. Tactical success, strategic victory, personal catastrophe. That night, alone in his hooch, Hawk took the river stone from his pocket and looked at it. His father's words echoed, "When you're lost, hold this and remember, the quieter you become, the more you hear." But Hawk didn't feel quiet. He felt like the loudest thing in the Delta. like his 14 seconds of fire had announced his presence to the entire war. Like every Viet Cong unit now knew there was a SEAL who moved like a ghost, but fought like a demon. He'd kept his promise. No KIAs. His team was intact. But the cost of keeping that promise was written in memories he couldn't erase and faces he couldn't forget. The object he carried, the river stone from Idaho, had meant stillness, patience, the ability to become invisible. Now it meant something different. It meant the price of being seen, of being loud, of violating every instinct he'd trained for 9 months, because silence would have meant body bags. Point men don't hesitate. That's what they say. That's what the doctrine teaches. But no one mentions what happens after you don't hesitate. After the decision is made, after the trigger is pulled, after you're standing in the aftermath realizing that doing the right thing doesn't mean it stops haunting you. Hawk walked point for 3 more months, then rotated stateside, then re-enlisted, then walked point again in 72, then rotated home permanently in 73 when the war ended not with victory, but with withdrawal. And through all of it, he carried that river stone. Not because it reminded him of Idaho, because it reminded him of 14 seconds in August 1970 when he'd made a choice that saved 7 lives, 6 American and his own, while taking 33 others. Tactical success, strategic victory, and a weight that never got lighter. Michael Hawk Hawkins returned to Boise, Idaho in March 1973. He was 27 years old. He looked 50. His father met him at the airport and didn't ask about Vietnam. Mountain men understand that some hunts don't get discussed. They drove home in silence. Hawk held the river stone the entire drive. Reintegration was brutal. Civilian employment felt meaningless. Conversations felt shallow. Sleep was impossible. Every sudden noise, car backfire, door slam, fireworks on the 4th of July, sent him back to that cache entrance, back to 14 seconds of fire, back to faces he couldn't forget. The VA diagnosed PTSD, prescribed medication, suggested therapy. Hawk tried all of it. None of it addressed the core problem. He didn't regret what he'd done. He regretted that it had to be done at all. He worked construction for 6 years, married a woman from Pocatello who understood that some silences can't be filled, had 2 sons, taught them to track elk through mountain timber, never told them about the Delta, never showed them the Stoner 63 citation that came 3 years late because someone in Washington finally recognized that 2 sentences in an after-action report didn't capture what had actually happened. The nightmares persisted for 40 years. Not every night, but often enough. He'd dream about the cache, about descending through the entrance, about muzzle flash in darkness, about Thau's face, and he'd wake up not afraid but guilty, because he'd survived and 33 others hadn't, because tactical success doesn't erase the memory of men who fought just as professionally on the other side. He served honorably. His brothers served honorably. The Viet Cong soldiers, those men in that cache who were just doing their jobs, protecting their supply lines, following their commander's orders, they served honorably too. They all did what they believed was right, with courage and skill that deserves recognition. The fault, when there was fault, lay in strategy and policy, in decisions made far from the battlefield by people who would never carry the cost. The soldiers did their part. The question is whether the leaders did theirs. War creates heroes on all sides. It also creates tragedies on all sides. The courage of one doesn't diminish the courage of the other. Both can be true. Both should be remembered. In 2014, Hawk traveled to Vietnam as a tourist. Not for closure. Closure is a myth. For context, he visited the Mekong Delta, hired a guide, asked to see the My Tho river system, found the area where the cache had been. Now farmland, completely transformed. No evidence of what had happened there 44 years earlier. He stood there for an hour, silent, processing. The guide asked if he'd been to Vietnam before. Hawk nodded. Long time ago. The guide, a Vietnamese man in his 60s, smiled. Many Americans return. They find peace here now. War is finished. We remember, but we don't hate. Hawk looked at him and realized something. The Vietnamese had moved on. They'd rebuilt. They'd forgiven. The only person still carrying the weight was him. He returned to Idaho, lived to 81, died in his sleep in 2027. His sons found the river stone in his pocket. They also found a weathered photo of 7 men standing next to a PBR, all of them young, all of them smiling, one of them holding a Stoner 63. On the back, in faded ink, Brothers, Nha Bay, 1970. We made it home. The cost he paid that day in August, the faces he carried, the decisions he made, the weight of 14 seconds that defined 40 years, he carried it until the day he died. Not because he regretted his actions, because he honored what they meant. He'd saved his brothers by doing something doctrine said was impossible. And he'd carried the memory of those who didn't make it home on the other side because they deserved to be carried too. Point men don't hesitate, but they also don't forget. That's the real cost of being the one who sees threats first. You see everything, and you carry it all. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Their decisions, the impossible ones made in seconds with incomplete information and no good options, those were real too. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences matter. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars. Because the men like Hawk, the ones who walked point, who made split-second calls, who carried teammates home and enemies in their memories, they did their job. The question is whether we did ours.